I'm Ron Patterson with Utah State University Extension in Carbon County. We're going to talk about pruning raspberries today. There are two different growth types of raspberries. They're all a perennial root with a biennial cane. Some are called ever-bearing or fall-bearing or primal cane. And then the other type of growth habit, the old traditional type of raspberry growth habit, is called floricane or summer-bearing. Now the summer-bearing or floricane raspberries will come up, they'll send up the cane 1 year, and then the second year is when they flower and fruit. And you prune those differently than you would with the primocane. The primocane raspberries, or the ever-bearing or fall-bearing raspberries, they'll send up the cane and they will flower and fruit that same year. So it's all on that first year cane, but they will also in that second year, if they haven't used up all their flowering buds, they will come in that second year and do some more flowering and fruiting. So you could prune them like you do a floricane, but generally speaking with primocanes, you want to prune them so that they just send up a shoot, send out the flowers and fruit, and then you cut them off. They're very nice to handle. In our country, in the high desert country of Utah, the primocane is actually the better raspberry to grow. The floricanes, they don't do as well. We get the warming in the spring and then freezing, warming, freezing, and then we get our strong spring winds, and they tend to kill those floricanes. So the floricanes don't do quite as well as the primocanes do. But I'll show you how to do pruning for both of those so that you can see if you've got a floricane variety or whatever. Now one of the things you have to be careful of when you purchase the primocane varieties is they don't all flower at the same time. Some varieties will flower earlier, like in July, and some will flower a little bit later in August, and some are actually even into September. And so you want to avoid those that flower late into the season, because you may not get much of a crop off from those from one year to the next. So you want to choose the varieties that flower and fruit earlier in the season. The canes that you cut out, sometimes depending on the variety that you're growing, may have insects living inside the canes, and so you want to dispose of the canes. You can chop them up and compost them. When you chop them up and see, I don't have anything growing in these particular canes, but when you cut off the end and you see a hollow in the end of it, that's a pretty good indicator that you may have the raspberry horntail wasp in your raspberries. And so you want to take those out and chop them up, compost them, or dispose of them, burn them, or throw them into the landfill. I kind of shy away from putting things in the landfill, but another thing to be aware of when you're doing your pruning, dispose of those canes or something so that you can kind of get rid of the problems that may be carrying from one year to the next. It's always a good idea to have gloves when you're dealing with raspberries, depending on the varieties. Almost all of the primocane varieties have thorns, and they can be kind of scratchy. There is one variety that doesn't, that I know of. There may be others, but there's one variety I know of that is a thornless primocane variety. Sometimes you get them growing out into your row, and it's not a bad idea to take your tiller and do a shallow tilling, not more than a couple inches down. Just do a shallow tilling to keep the stuff from growing out in the middle of the row. But at least you want to take and cut out everything that's growing out here in the middle. You don't want to let those grow out. I've seen old raspberry patches that would start in one spot and they'll move across the garden, and a few years later they'll be in a new spot. That's one way to move them if you keep them contained, but if you want to keep them within the row, make sure you take out these that are growing up here in the middle. With the primocane raspberries, all your intent is to just cut them all off at ground level. Some will come in with the lawnmower, just mow them right off. That's a pretty easy way to do it. I tend to take my loppers or my hand pruners. Those are the only really tools you need. And I cut them off. Takes a little bit longer than if you're going to do it with your lawnmower. One thing that you might do during the summer, if you've got primocanes, sometimes they'll send up these little tiny canes that aren't really going to produce anything, and you can go through the summer and kind of clean those out if you want to, but it really doesn't serve a whole lot of purpose. Now if you're going to do floricanes, what you want to end up with, when you're doing floricanes, you want to take out all of the dead canes, which would be last year's flowering canes, and then keep 4 to 6 of this last year's primal canes, or the first year canes from last year. You want 4 to 6 of those every 12 inches. So if this were my raspberry bed here, and I don't have any floricanes, we'll just assume that these were last year's, that was last year's flowering cane. So I'd take those out first, and then once I get to that point, I want to thin out the remaining primocanes so that there's maybe every 2 or 3 inches between each one of those canes. So you got a foot here, a foot there, and you want to keep them contained within the row so that they're fairly close together. And so if we look at that, we've got, move that one out of the way. If these were my floricanes here, I got about a foot right there, and there's 4 or 5. I want to keep the row narrow, and then within about every foot you want to have 4 to 6, no more than 6 canes of those floricanes in there. Then when they come out this next year and they flower, they're not going to crowd out as much. The production is a little bit better if you do it that way than if it's crowded. With the primocanes, you just whack them all off and let them grow up this next year. So that's how you prune the raspberries, and you do that each year and you get a good raspberry crop, and raspberries are delicious. That's the best fruit in the world, higher in antioxidants even than blueberries are. So there you have it, just another way to have fun in your garden.